I have no idea what race I am. So what are you? The girl at Starbucks asked while writing my name on the cup. Human, I said, because this happened literally every day. No, but like what are you? She pressed. Indian, Latino, Middle Eastern. You look kinda everything. I honestly don't know, I said. She laughed like I was joking, but I wasn't. I was 17 years old and had no idea what race I was because my parents refused to tell me. At dinner that night, I tried again. Mom, what ethnicity are we? We're American, she said, passing the salad. But before that, I said. Before that, we were younger, my dad said, and they both laughed like it was hilarious. I'm serious, I said. People ask me all the time and I have nothing to tell them. Tell them you're from Earth, my mom said, third planet from the sun. So I tried asking my grandmother on the phone. Grandma, what's our heritage? Oh, sweetie, we're from Ohio, she said. No, I mean like ancestry, I said. My ancestors are from Ohio too, she said. What about before Ohio? I asked. Before Ohio, there was nothing, she said, and hung up. I went through every family photo album looking for clues. Maybe traditional clothing or cultural celebrations or food that might give me hints. But every single photo was aggressively neutral. Backyard barbecues with hamburgers, Christmas with a generic tree. Nothing ethnic anywhere. I tried to trick my mom while she was distracted doing taxes. Hey Mom, what should I put for race on this college application? What are the options? She asked without looking up. White, black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, Pacific Islander, I said. Put yes, she said. That's not an option, I said. Then put no, she said. I Googled our last name trying to find its origin. The internet said it was either French, Vietnamese, Nigerian, or possibly made up entirely. One website said it meant bread maker, and another said it meant son of the mountain. At school, I asked the Spanish teacher if I looked Hispanic. She said maybe. I asked the Mandarin teacher if I looked Chinese. He said possibly. I asked the French teacher if I looked French, and she said, everyone looks a little French if you squint. I saved up money to buy a DNA test kit. When it arrived, my parents were waiting in the living room like an intervention. We can't let you do that, my dad said. Why? I asked. The companies sell your data, my mom said. I don't care about my data, I said. You will when you're older, my dad said, taking the kit. Trust us. I had my friend Jeremy order one to his house instead, but when I went to pick it up, his mom said my mom had called and asked her not to let me have it. They'd coordinated against me. I tried asking my doctor at my physical. So, what ethnic background would you say I am, medically speaking? That's not really a medical question, he said. But certain races have certain health risks, I said. I'd Googled some to prepare. Should I be worried about sickle cell? Tay-Sachs? Your parents said you might ask about this, he said. I'm not supposed to discuss it with you. You're my doctor, I said. I'm the family doctor, he said. I got desperate and went to the public library to research genealogy records. I searched for hours and found records for everyone with my last name going back to the 1800s. But when I got to my parents' generation, everything stopped. No birth records, no marriage licenses, nothing. That's odd, the librarian said, looking over my shoulder. It's like your family just appeared out of nowhere in 1999. That's 3 years before I was born, I said. Maybe they changed their names? She suggested. I searched for name change records but found nothing. Then I noticed something strange. The librarian had written down my parents' names to help search, but when I came back from the bathroom, the paper was gone, and she acted like she'd never seen me before. I was just here, I said. You were helping me with genealogy. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. The library is closing. It was 2 p.m. The library didn't close until 8. I snuck into my dad's home office looking for any documents that might list race or ethnicity. I found my birth certificate, but where it should have listed my parents' race, someone had put whiteout. Actual whiteout on an official document. When I held it up to the light, I could see something underneath, but couldn't make it out. What are you doing? My dad said from the doorway. Looking for answers, I said. You won't find them there, he said, taking the certificate. Then where? I asked. When you're 18, he said. We'll tell you when you're 18. That's in 6 months, I said. Then wait 6 months, he said. But I couldn't wait. I knew now that something weird was going on. So I convinced the school nurse to take a cheek swab for a biology project and mailed it to a DNA company myself. I had the results sent to Jeremy's email so my parents wouldn't know. 6 weeks later, Jeremy called me. The results are in. I went to his house and we sat at his computer. My parents thought I was at soccer practice. They had no idea I was about to find out what they'd been hiding my entire life. Ready? Jeremy asked with his finger on the mouse. Click it, I said. The results loaded and Jeremy's face went completely white. I looked at the screen and couldn't understand what I was seeing. The screen showed 43 people listed as half-sibling matches. Below that was an ethnicity breakdown that looked like someone had mixed together every possible ancestry test result. West African 18%, Eastern European 22%, South Asian 15%. Indigenous American 12%, Middle Eastern 20%, and a bunch of smaller percentages that added up to me being basically everything at once. My hands started shaking so bad I had to put the laptop down on Jeremy's desk before I dropped it. This explained why nobody could ever figure out what I looked like, but now I had about 1,000 new questions and 0 answers. Jeremy leaned over my shoulder and made a low whistling sound when he saw the list of matches. He pointed at the number 43 with his finger and said that couldn't be normal, that people don't usually have that many half-siblings. I grabbed my phone and started taking screenshots of everything before the page could disappear, or my parents could somehow find out and make it vanish like they did with everything else. I saved the ethnicity breakdown, the list of matches, the donor number that was apparently mine, all of it. Jeremy watched me screenshot for a solid 5 minutes without saying anything. I spent the rest of the afternoon on Jeremy's bed scrolling through the profiles of my half-siblings on his laptop. Most of them were between 15 and 25 years old, and they were scattered across 12 different states: California, Texas, Michigan, Florida, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Illinois, Washington, Colorado, Arizona. Some had posted in a message board asking if anyone else had the same donor number, which I now knew was mine too. Donor 4472. That was apparently what I was called before I became a person with a name. Several people had written things like, "Anyone else match with 4472?" and "Looking for 4472 siblings," and 4472 group chat link here. I clicked through to the group chat, but you needed an account to see it, so I made one using a fake email. That night at dinner, I could barely eat because I kept thinking about the results hidden in Jeremy's email account. My mom passed me the chicken and asked if I was feeling okay. I said I was fine, just stressed about college applications. Dad asked if I needed help with my essay, and I shook my head. Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand, which she does when she thinks I'm upset about something. I had to resist the urge to pull away because all I could think about was how she'd been lying to me for 17 years. I went to bed early and told them I had a headache. I lay awake until 2 in the morning reading through the message boards where my half-siblings had been connecting for years. They shared photos in some of the threads, and I could see pieces of myself scattered across different faces. Someone in California had my nose exactly. Someone in Texas had my eye shape and the same way their eyebrows curved. Someone in Michigan had my chin and jawline. It was like looking at a puzzle of myself broken up and spread across the country in strangers' faces. Some of them looked more like one ethnicity than others, but we all had these similar features that showed up in different combinations. The next morning, Jeremy pulled me aside before first period started and told me something weird. He said his mom had worked at a fertility clinic about 15 years ago, before he was born. She was just a volunteer helping out in the office, but she'd mentioned it once when they were talking about medical stuff. The coincidence felt too big to ignore. I asked which clinic, but he didn't remember the name. He said he could try to find out if I wanted. That afternoon during study hall, I logged into the DNA website and messaged one of the half-siblings through their platform. I picked someone named Raj who seemed really active in the forums and had answered a lot of other people's questions. I kept my message simple and just said I'd just gotten my results and saw we were a match, then asked if he'd known about all this before testing. I hit send before I could overthink it, and then spent the rest of study hall refreshing my email waiting for a response that didn't come. My parents must have sensed something was going on, because they were extra attentive at dinner that night. Dad asked detailed questions about my day and what classes I had and how soccer practice went. Mom asked about my college essay and whether I'd finished my applications yet. Then Dad mentioned again that they'd tell me everything when I turned 18 in March, just a few more months, and they promised it would make sense then. I nodded and said okay, even though I already knew way more than they thought I did. I met with Becca Whitehead the next week to work on my college applications. She's my guidance counselor, and she'd been bugging me to finish the Common App for weeks. We sat in her office going through each section, and when we got to the demographic part, she asked how I wanted to identify racially. I stared at the checkboxes on her computer screen. White, black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, Pacific Islander. My throat got tight and I couldn't make myself pick one. Becca noticed I'd gone quiet and asked if I was okay. I told her I honestly didn't know what to check because my parents wouldn't tell me our background. She got this careful look on her face, the kind adults get when they think something might be wrong at home. She asked if this was causing me distress, and I almost laughed because distress didn't even begin to cover 17 years of having no answer to the most basic question about myself. I left Becca's office and headed to my locker to grab my stuff before soccer practice. Jeremy was waiting by the water fountain near the gym like he always did on Tuesdays. I walked over and asked if I could talk to him about something important. He said sure, and we moved to the empty stairwell by the science labs. I brought up his mom working at that fertility clinic and asked if he could maybe find out which one it was, or if she remembered anything about donors or records. Jeremy's face changed immediately. He took a step back and shook his head. He said his mom had been getting weird phone calls from my mom for the past week, and she was really uncomfortable about the whole thing. I felt my chest get tight, I asked what kind of calls, and he said my mom kept asking his mom not to talk to me about the clinic or help me with anything related to it. I couldn't believe they were coordinating behind my back again. I told Jeremy I just needed information, and his mom might be the only person who could help me. He said he didn't want to be in the middle of this anymore, and it was making things weird between our families. I snapped that he was already in the middle by letting me use his email for the DNA test. He said that was different, and he was starting to regret it. We stood there staring at each other, and I could feel everything getting tense and wrong between us. He walked away first, and I didn't try to stop him. We didn't talk at all the next day at the school. We didn't talk the day after that either. 3 days after I sent that message to Raj, I got a notification on my phone during math class. I waited until lunch to check it in the bathroom where nobody could see my screen. Raj had written back. He said, yeah, he'd found out about everything 2 years ago when he turned 18 and got access to his records. He said our donor was used a lot, way more than normal. He said there was a private group of half-siblings if I wanted to join where they shared medical information and tried to figure out who else was out there. He included a link to a private forum. I clicked it right away and it asked me to create a username. I made up a fake name because I wasn't ready for everyone to know who I was yet. The forum loaded and I saw dozens of posts going back years. I scrolled through thread after thread during the rest of lunch, sitting on the floor in the bathroom stall with my phone. The first thing I noticed was a pinned post at the top that said there were actually 62 confirmed half-siblings in the group. That was way more than the 43 who showed up on my DNA match list. Some people had never tested, or they'd used different companies that didn't share data. Everyone called our donor by a number instead of a name. Donor 4472. There were threads about trying to find him, and threads about medical history, and threads just for people to introduce themselves and share photos. I found the health concerns thread and started reading. My hands were shaking so much I almost dropped my phone. Multiple people reported having heart problems. One person wrote about arrhythmia that started when they were 19. Another person described something called cardiomyopathy that required surgery when they were 23. I had to Google what that word meant, and when I read that it was a disease of the heart muscle, I felt sick. Several other people mentioned autoimmune disorders, and there was a whole discussion in the comments about whether these were just coincidences or if they were inherited risks we all needed to know about. Someone pointed out that nobody had been able to contact the donor directly to ask about his medical history because the clinic had closed years ago and all the records were sealed. Another person said they'd tried to get information through a lawyer but hit a dead end. I kept reading until the bell rang for 5th period, and I was late to class. I called my family doctor's office that afternoon from my car in the school parking lot. The receptionist answered, and I asked to make an appointment for a heart screening. She asked why I needed one, and I said I was worried about heart disease running in my family. She put me on hold for a minute, and when she came back, she said I would need a parent to authorize any new tests since I was still a minor. I asked if I could just come in and talk to the doctor about it, and she said no. All new appointments for minors required parental consent. I hung up without saying goodbye. I sat in my car feeling trapped by my age and my parents' secrecy and a medical system that wouldn't let me access information about my own body. I had real health concerns based on what my half-siblings were reporting, but I couldn't do anything about it without my parents' permission. That night at dinner, I brought it up as casually as I could. I said some guys on the soccer team had to get heart screenings, and I thought it would be a good idea for me to get one too. Mom and Dad both looked up from their plates at the same time. They did that thing where they made eye contact with each other and had an entire conversation without words. Dad asked why I was suddenly worried about my heart. I shrugged and said I just wanted to be careful and make sure everything was okay. Mom asked if something happened at practice or if I was having symptoms. I said no, I just thought it was smart to get checked. Dad said those tests were expensive and probably unnecessary for someone my age with no symptoms. I pushed back and said it would give me peace of mind. Mom said they would think about it, but I could tell from her voice that thinking about it meant no. The next day, I spent my lunch period in the library instead of the cafeteria. I went to the computer section in the back and searched for information about birth certificates and vital records. I learned that amended birth certificates were common in adoption cases where the adoptive parents' names replaced the birth parents' names on the official document. I learned that original birth certificates could be sealed by court order and that accessing them usually required a lawyer and a really good reason. Then I searched for my parents' names in the county birth records database just to see what would come up. I typed in my mom's name first and got nothing before 1999. I tried my dad's name and got the same result. No birth records, no marriage license, nothing. It was like they didn't exist before 3 years before I was born. I wrote down the website addresses and some notes about sealed records on a piece of paper and folded it into my pocket. I went back to the library the next day during lunch to do more research. The same librarian was working at the front desk, but when I walked up and asked for help finding more genealogy records, she looked at me like she'd never seen me before. She said she didn't remember helping me yesterday. I reminded her about the search we did for my parents' names and how we found that gap in the records. She got this confused look on her face and said she must be thinking of someone else. I pulled out my notes from yesterday and showed her the website addresses she'd helped me find. She looked at the paper and then back at me, and her face got red. She said the genealogy section was reorganized and I needed to leave. I asked when I could come back and she said she didn't know. The whole interaction felt completely wrong, like someone had talked to her or warned her not to help me anymore. I found a student journalist in my English class the next day. Her name was Cassidy, and she wrote for the school paper. I sat down next to her before class started and asked her a hypothetical question about students' rights to access their own medical information. Her eyes lit up immediately and she pulled out a notebook. She started asking me questions about why I was researching this and whether I knew someone who was having problems getting medical records. I kept my answers vague and said I was just curious about the legal side of things. She was sharp, though, and I could tell she sensed there was a real story behind my questions. She said she'd look into it and maybe write something for the paper if I wanted to talk more. Jeremy found me sitting alone at lunch 2 days after our argument. He sat down across from me without asking and said he was sorry for getting defensive. I said I was sorry for pushing about his mom. He asked how I was doing and I admitted that the whole thing was making me paranoid. I told him it felt like everyone was in on some secret except me. Jeremy said that was probably not far from the truth, and I knew he was trying to make me feel better, but it didn't work. We agreed to stop fighting about it and just be friends again. I was relieved because I needed at least one person at the school who I could trust. 2 days later, my parents were waiting in the living room when I got home from the school. Dad had his laptop open on the coffee table, and Mom sat next to him with her arms crossed. I knew immediately something was wrong because they never sat like that unless it was serious. Dad turned the screen toward me, and I saw the browser history from the family computer pulled up with all my searches highlighted in yellow. Birth certificates, sealed records, name changes, fertility clinics. I'd been so careful to use Jeremy's computer for the DNA stuff, but I'd gotten sloppy with the other research. Mom's face looked red like she'd been crying, and Dad kept clenching his jaw the way he did when he was trying not to yell. They made me sit down on the chair across from them, and Dad started talking about privacy and boundaries and how I needed to respect their reasons for waiting until I turned 18. Mom kept saying some things are complicated, and they weren't trying to hurt me. I could see she was genuinely upset, not just angry, and that made it harder to stay mad. But I was still furious because they'd had 17 years to figure out how to tell me, and instead they just kept hiding everything. The talk went in circles for almost an hour with them saying wait and me saying I couldn't wait and nobody getting anywhere. Finally, Dad said if I kept pushing, they'd have to take away my computer privileges entirely, and Mom nodded, even though she looked miserable about it. That night, I got a notification on my phone from the DNA platform. Someone named Raj wanted to video chat. I waited until my parents went to bed, then set up my laptop in my room with the door locked. When the call connected, I saw a guy who looked maybe 19 or 20 with the same skin tone as me and similar features. We had the same slightly crooked smile and the same shape to our eyes. It was like looking at a version of myself from a couple years in the future. He waved at the camera and said, "Welcome to the sibling club. It's weird at first, but you get used to it. Well, sort of." His voice was casual, but I could tell he remembered what it felt like to be new to all this. We talked for a few minutes about where we lived and how we found out, and he told me there was a whole group of us trying to figure things out together. Then Raj said his sister wanted to say hi, and another face appeared on the screen. Sita looked younger than Raj, maybe 17 like me, and she had darker hair but similar features. She explained they lived in Minnesota and found out about each other through the same DNA test 2 years ago. She pulled up a document on her screen and showed me how the group had been trying to track down information about the clinic and the donor, but kept hitting dead ends. The clinic shut down 8 years ago after some kind of legal trouble, and all the records got sealed or destroyed. She said they had a private forum where everyone shared what they knew and tried to piece things together. There were medical histories and family trees and timelines of when people were conceived. It was way more organized than I expected. Sita said some people had managed to get partial information through lawyers, but most of the parents had signed agreements that kept everything locked down. Then Sita told me about Amaya, one of our half-siblings who had to get emergency heart surgery last year at age 24. She pulled up a photo of a girl who looked healthy and normal, smiling at a beach somewhere. Sita explained that Amaya collapsed at work one day, and they found out she had a genetic heart condition. The doctors kept asking about family history, but she couldn't tell them anything because she didn't know about all of us yet. After she recovered and joined the group, she shared all her medical records so the rest of us would know to get checked. Sita said that's why they try to share medical stuff now because it could literally save someone's life. She sent me a link to a shared document with all the health information people had reported. I scrolled through it and saw multiple mentions of heart issues, some autoimmune disorders, a few cases of early hearing loss. It was scary seeing it all laid out like that, knowing any of it could be waiting for me too. The next morning at breakfast, I brought up the heart screening again. I tried to sound casual and said I'd been reading that heart disease can run in families and I was worried about it. Dad looked up from his coffee and asked if someone said something to me about family health history. I could feel him watching my face for clues. I stayed vague and said I just wanted to be checked because some guys on the soccer team had to get screenings, and it seemed like a good idea. Mom and Dad did their silent communication thing where they just looked at each other for a few seconds. Finally, Mom said she'd look into it, but I needed to stop obsessing over things I couldn't control. Dad added that these tests were expensive, and I shouldn't go looking for problems that probably weren't there. I wanted to tell them about Amaya and the shared medical document, but I knew that would just prove I'd been talking to the half-siblings they didn't want me connecting with. At the school the next day, 3 different people asked me if it was true that I didn't know what race I was. The first was a girl from my math class who cornered me at my locker before first period. Then 2 guys from the soccer team brought it up at lunch like it was some kind of joke. Apparently someone had overheard me talking to Cassidy about identity stuff, and the rumor spread through the school overnight. I felt exposed and angry, like my private struggle had just become school gossip for people to talk about in the hallways. By last period, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my stuff and walked out of class, told the hall monitor I felt sick, and drove around town for an hour instead of going home. I ended up parked at the empty soccer fields, just sitting in my car trying to calm down. My phone buzzed with texts from Jeremy asking where I was, but I didn't answer. The next morning, Cassidy found me in the parking lot before school started. She walked up looking guilty and said she needed to apologize. She explained she'd mentioned my questions to another reporter on the school paper, without using my name, but people figured it out anyway. I could tell she felt bad about it, but that didn't make me less mad. Then she said she wanted to make it up to me by helping research sealed records and minor rights. She'd already started looking into it and had some information about legal processes. I was too tired to stay mad at her, and honestly, I needed whatever help I could get. We agreed to meet in the library during lunch to go over what she'd found. That weekend, my parents got a phone call from the school counselor about my distress regarding family identity issues. I wasn't there when the call happened, but I heard them talking about it in the kitchen afterward. When they called me downstairs, the conversation got explosive fast. Dad accused me of making them look bad and embarrassing the family by talking about private stuff at the school. Mom started crying and saying they'd tried so hard to give me a normal life. I yelled back that normal includes knowing basic facts about yourself and not having to lie when people ask simple questions. Dad said I was being dramatic and ungrateful. I said they were being secretive and controlling. Mom said I didn't understand how hard this was for them. I said they didn't understand how hard it was for me to live 17 years not knowing who I was. We went back and forth until I was shouting and Mom was sobbing and Dad told me to go to my room. I locked myself in and pulled out the hidden phone to message the half-sibling group. I typed out everything that had happened with my parents and the school counselor and feeling like I was losing my mind. Within an hour, I had responses from a dozen people sharing their own stories. Rory from Michigan said he didn't speak to his parents for a year after finding out they'd lied to him his whole life. Dinesh from 2 towns over said his parents still won't acknowledge the truth, even though he's shown them the DNA results. Someone named Maya said her mom finally admitted everything, but only after Maya threatened to cut off contact completely. Reading through all the messages made me feel less alone, but also more angry that this was such a common experience. All these parents making the same choice to hide the truth, and all these kids dealing with the same confusion and anger. On Monday, Cassidy found me after school and said she'd connected with someone who might be able to help. A legal aid attorney named Heather Marshall, who sometimes helped students with family law questions. Cassidy had already reached out, and Heather agreed to meet with me. We set it up for Wednesday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown. I told my parents I had a study group and drove there after school. Heather was already sitting at a corner table with a notepad and a coffee when I arrived. She looked maybe 35 with glasses and a kind face. I sat down and started explaining everything from the beginning. The DNA test, the 43 half-siblings, my parents' refusal to provide information, the sealed records, the browser history confrontation, all of it. She listened carefully and took notes without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a few questions about the timeline and whether I had copies of any documents. I showed her screenshots on my phone of the DNA results and some of the half-sibling forum posts. She studied them for a minute, then looked up and said we needed to talk about what my options actually were as a minor. Heather pulled out a folder with papers and started going through what I could and couldn't do legally. She explained that minors have almost no rights when it comes to sealed records or medical decisions without parents saying yes. The system protects kids, but sometimes that protection becomes a wall, she said. I could try to ask a court for my original birth certificate, but I'd need a lawyer and my parents would find out right away. The whole process could take months or even years and might not work. She wrote down some names of lawyers who handle this stuff, but warned me they cost money I probably didn't have. I left the coffee shop feeling more trapped than before. That night, I Googled the county records office and found a supervisor named Ken Roman who dealt with birth certificates and sealed records. I waited until my parents were both at work the next day and called from Jeremy's phone. I told Ken I was doing research for a school project about sealed records. He seemed happy to explain how it all worked. He said name changes and sealed records happen a lot in adoption cases and in legal settlements with fertility clinics. If there was a settlement, those records usually get locked up really tight, he said. Sometimes courts seal everything as part of the agreement. I thanked him and hung up, then sat in my car in the school parking lot just staring at the steering wheel. Everything clicked into place in my head. I was almost definitely donor conceived from a clinic that had problems. My parents changed their names and sealed all the records as part of some legal deal. They'd been hiding this my whole life. Everyone knew. Grandma knew. My doctor knew. Even Jeremy's mom knew. They'd all been helping my parents keep this secret from me for 17 years. I drove home and called Grandma from my room with the door locked. I asked her straight out about fertility treatments and donor conception. The phone went silent for so long I thought she'd hung up. Then she said I needed to talk to my parents about this and it wasn't her story to tell. But right before she hung up, she said something that made my stomach drop. The agency promised us it would be private, she said. Then the line went dead. I barely had time to process what she'd said before my dad knocked on my door. He came in looking really mad and asked if I'd been making phone calls about family business. Turns out the county records office had caller ID, and Ken had called my parents to let them know someone was asking questions about sealed records from their address. Dad took my phone right out of my hand. Mom came in and took my laptop. They said I was grounded until I could respect their privacy and their choices. I was so mad I couldn't even speak. But part of me had been ready for this. I'd already hidden Jeremy's old phone in a box under my bed with all my half-sibling contacts saved. That night after my parents went to sleep, I pulled out the hidden phone and messaged the group. Within an hour, Dinesh responded. He lived only 30 minutes away and offered to meet in person. We set it up for Saturday at a park between our towns. I'd tell my parents I had soccer practice. Jeremy said he'd cover for me if anyone asked. Saturday morning, I drove to the park and found Dinesh sitting at a picnic table near the playground. When I walked up, I felt weird because we looked similar enough that people might think we were cousins or even brothers. Same skin tone, same height, similar face shape. We shook hands and sat down and he started telling me his story. He found out at 16 when his parents finally told him after he kept pushing. His parents had also changed their names. He'd been fighting for information for 2 years now. It gets a little easier, he said, but the anger doesn't really go away. We spent 2 hours comparing everything we knew. Then Dinesh suggested we try to find the actual fertility clinic together. We went back to his house and used old phone books and internet archives to track down the address. It took forever, but we finally found it. We drove there together and my heart was racing the whole way. But when we pulled up to the address, it was a dentist office. We went inside and asked the receptionist about the fertility clinic. She got the property manager on the phone for us. He said the clinic closed in 2015 after some legal problems. All the records got sealed or destroyed. Another dead end. I drove home feeling defeated. Then on Monday, Cassidy found me before first period. She'd written an article for the school paper about students' rights to their own medical information and family history. She didn't use my name, but she included quotes from our interview about donor conception and sealed records. The article went up on the school website that morning. By lunch, my parents had seen it. They called me out of class to come home. The drive back was silent and awful. At home, they asked if I'd talk to a reporter about our private family matters. I said yes because I needed help and they weren't giving me any. Mom started crying. Dad said I'd embarrassed them and broken their trust. I said they'd lied to me for 17 years, so maybe we were even. Nobody won that fight. The next day at the school, my soccer coach pulled me aside and said I was benched for creating problems. He didn't say it was because of the article, but I knew. In the hallways, some teachers gave me these sad, sympathetic looks that made me want to disappear. But then something unexpected happened. 3 different students came up to me between classes. One girl said she was adopted and never knew other people dealt with the same kind of secrecy. A guy from my English class said he was donor conceived too, and his parents also wouldn't tell him anything. Another kid said their family had sealed records from a custody case, and they understood how it felt to have your own history kept from you. By the end of the day, I felt totally exposed, like everyone at the school knew my business. But I also felt less alone than I had in months. Maybe going public wasn't the worst thing after all. 2 days later, I got a private message through the half-sibling forum from an account I didn't recognize. The username was just a string of numbers and the profile was blank. The message said she was a nurse at the clinic and saw the article. She could tell me some things off the record but couldn't be named because she signed an NDA. At the bottom was a phone number with no area code prefix. I stared at my phone for 10 minutes before I saved the number and texted back asking when we could meet. She replied within seconds with an address for a diner in the next town over and a time for that Saturday. I told my parents I needed to study at the library for a big test. Mom offered to drive me, but I said Jeremy was picking me up. The lie came out so smooth it scared me a little. Saturday morning, I drove 40 minutes to the diner and parked in the back lot where my car wouldn't be visible from the road. Inside, the diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease. A woman sitting alone in a corner booth raised her hand slightly when I walked in. She looked tired in a way that went deeper than just needing sleep. Her name was Jessie, and she was probably in her 50s with gray streaks in her brown hair. I slid into the booth across from her, and she pushed a menu toward me even though neither of us ordered anything except coffee. She got straight to the point once the waitress left. The clinic used donor 4472 way more than recommended, over 100 times in a small geographic area. She said the doctor wanted to maximize profits and didn't care about the guidelines that said donors shouldn't be used more than 25 times. When families started figuring it out and kids started meeting each other accidentally at the school or sports, there were lawsuits. That's why everything got sealed. She stirred sugar into her coffee and wouldn't look directly at me while she talked. I asked her how many of us there really were, and she said she didn't know the exact number, but it was over 100 confirmed. Some families never found out and some kids never tested. The donor was screened for basic genetic issues, but not thoroughly. When health problems started showing up in the offspring, the clinic didn't follow up. They just paid families to go away quietly. She said there were settlements with probably 20 families, and all of them had confidentiality clauses. Your parents probably got money to cover future medical costs and agreed never to pursue the donor's identity or sue again. I asked if she knew the donor's name, and she shook her head. The clinic used numbers only, and she was just a nurse who handled paperwork and scheduling. She never met any of the donors face-to-face. Before she left, she said she was sorry for what happened to all of us kids. Then she put $20 on the table for the coffee we didn't drink and walked out. I sat there for another 15 minutes trying to process everything. Then I drove straight to Heather's office, even though it was Saturday, and I didn't have an appointment. She was there doing paperwork and let me in when I knocked. I told her everything Jesse said about the settlements and the NDAs and the donor being used over 100 times. Heather listened and took notes on a yellow legal pad. She explained that the settlement and NDA my parents signed probably prevents them from telling me anything until I'm 18 and legally separate from their agreement. They might actually be legally prohibited from disclosure right now. Once you're an adult, the restrictions on you personally should lift, but it's complicated. She said the clinic's bankruptcy and closure made everything harder because there's no entity left to petition for records. I asked what I could do, and she suggested family therapy as a way to work through this without legal action that could take years. Your parents are probably scared and dealing with their own trauma about infertility and the clinic's negligence. That doesn't excuse keeping you in the dark, but it might explain it. She wrote down a name and number on a sticky note. Niall Peterson was a therapist who specialized in family communication and difficult conversations. Heather said he'd worked with other donor-conceived people and their parents before. I took the sticky note and thanked her and left. That week, I went to soccer practice even though I was still benched. We were doing sprint drills when I felt a sharp pain in my chest that made me stop mid-run. The coach yelled at me to keep moving and said I was faking to get out of running laps. But the pain got worse and spread across my chest like someone was squeezing my ribs. I sat down on the grass and tried to breathe normally. The coach came over and asked if I was seriously hurt or just being dramatic. I said I didn't know, but something felt wrong. He let me sit out the rest of practice, but I could tell he didn't believe me. Afterward, I sat in my car for 20 minutes debating whether to go home or go to urgent care. The pain had faded to a dull ache, but I kept thinking about Amaya and her heart surgery. I drove to the urgent care clinic near the mall. The waiting room was empty except for a kid with a cough and his mom. I filled out paperwork, and when they called me back, the doctor was young and seemed rushed. He did an EKG by sticking a bunch of electrodes on my chest. The machine beeped and printed out a long strip of paper with squiggly lines. He looked at it and said it looked normal, but recommended follow-up with a cardiologist given my family history of heart issues. I tried to explain that I didn't have access to my family history, and he looked confused. He said I should bring a parent to the follow-up appointment. I left with paperwork and instructions I couldn't fully follow without my parents' help. The paper said to schedule a cardiology consultation within 2 weeks and to avoid strenuous exercise until then. I drove home and left the urgent care paperwork on the kitchen table where my parents would see it. Then I went upstairs and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. When they got home from wherever they'd been, Mom found the paperwork first. I heard her call Dad over and they talked in low voices for a few minutes. Then Mom called me downstairs. I came down and stood in the doorway of the kitchen. She asked what happened and I explained about the chest pain at practice and driving myself to urgent care. Dad picked up the paperwork and read through it carefully. He looked genuinely scared for the first time in this whole thing. Not angry or defensive, just scared. They asked why I didn't call them and I said I didn't want to worry them over nothing. Mom said chest pain is never nothing, especially at my age. They agreed to make an appointment with a cardiologist. Dad called first thing Monday morning and got an appointment for 2 weeks out. The wait was terrible. I spent those 2 weeks monitoring every heartbeat and chest sensation. Anytime I felt the slightest twinge, I'd stop what I was doing and focus on my breathing. I researched cardiomyopathy online and read through Amaya's posts about her surgery in the half-sibling forum. She'd had to have part of her heart muscle removed because it was too thick and blocking blood flow. The surgery was successful, but she'd be on medication for the rest of her life. Other people in the group reassured me that most of them were fine, and I was probably okay too. But the uncertainty was exhausting. I could barely focus in class because I kept thinking about my heart. At night, I'd lie awake feeling my pulse and wondering if it was beating too fast or too slow or irregular. Finally, the appointment day arrived. The cardiologist's office was in a medical building downtown. Drew Landry was younger than I expected, maybe in his 30s with dark hair and glasses. He actually listened when I explained the situation about being donor-conceived and having half-siblings with heart problems. He didn't seem judgmental or confused like the urgent care doctor. He did an echocardiogram, which was basically an ultrasound of my heart. I lay on an exam table while he moved a wand around on my chest and looked at a screen showing my heart beating in real time. It was weird seeing the inside of my own body like that. Then he had me do a stress test on a treadmill with electrodes stuck all over my chest. The treadmill started slow and got faster and steeper every few minutes until I was running hard and breathing heavy. When it was over, he printed out more strips of paper and studied them for a long time. Everything came back normal. My heart structure looked good, and there were no signs of the thickening that Amaya had. But he said, given the family history I described, I should be monitored annually. Heart conditions can develop over time, especially in your 20s. You did the right thing getting checked. He scheduled a follow-up for 1 year out and said to come back sooner if I had any more chest pain or unusual symptoms. I left his office feeling relieved, but also aware that this was something I'd have to deal with for the rest of my life. Annual checkups and constant awareness of my heart because of a donor I'd never met and a clinic that used him too many times. I drove home from the cardiology appointment with my hands tight on the steering wheel. The clean bill of health should have made me feel better, but instead I just felt more determined. I had information now. I had proof of health risks. I had leverage. My parents were home when I pulled into the driveway, and I walked straight into the living room where they were watching TV. I stood in front of the screen until Dad hit pause on the remote. I need to talk to you both right now. They looked at each other with that same worried expression they always had when I brought this up. I stayed standing because sitting felt like giving up ground. I know about the donor conception. I know about the clinic and the settlements. I know I have at least 60 half-siblings. My voice shook, but I kept going. I'm not asking you to break any legal agreements, but I need you to stop pretending this isn't real. Mom's face crumpled and she started crying immediately. Dad put his arm around her shoulders and they sat there for a long moment. Then Dad took a deep breath and started talking. We struggled with infertility for years. We tried everything. The treatments were expensive and painful and nothing worked. When we found the clinic, it felt like a miracle. They said the donor was thoroughly screened and local and available. We just wanted a baby. We didn't think about what it would mean for you later. Mom wiped her eyes and nodded. The clinic made it seem so simple and safe. They said lots of families used donors and the kids turned out fine. We thought we were doing the right thing. Dad stood up and left the room. He came back a few minutes later with a folder full of papers. These are from the settlement. Most of it is redacted, but you can see enough. He spread the documents on the coffee table, and I sat down to look at them. Pages and pages with thick black bars covering names and details. But I could see dollar amounts. $35,000. I could see phrases like sealed records and name change requirement and confidentiality clause. The clinic paid us after everything came out about the donor being used too much. They made us change our last name and seal all the records related to your conception. Dad's voice was quiet. We thought we were protecting you from harassment, protecting ourselves from judgment. We didn't know how to tell you later without it seeming like we'd been lying your whole life, which we had been. I looked at the documents and felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding maybe. I need access to my medical information. I need the right to know my half-siblings. I'm not trying to replace you or say you're not my real parents, but these people share my DNA and my health risks. I need to be able to make informed decisions about my own body. Mom reached across the table and put her hand over mine. We'll work with you on this. I promise. We should have done this sooner. I took another breath. I want you to meet one of them. One of my half-siblings. With me. So you can see they're real people and not some threat. My parents looked at each other again. Dad nodded slowly. Okay, we can do that. It took another week to arrange everything. I messaged Dinesh and asked if he and his mom would meet my parents for coffee. He said yes immediately. His mom was nervous but willing. I spent the whole week worried my parents would back out. They kept asking questions about Dinesh and his family. What's he like? How old is he? Does he look like you? I answered everything honestly. The morning of the meeting, I could barely eat breakfast. We drove to a coffee shop in a town between ours and Dinesh's. Neutral territory. My parents were quiet in the car. When we walked in, Dinesh and his mom were already sitting at a corner table. Dinesh stood up when he saw us, and I could see my mom's face change. The resemblance was obvious even from across the room. We sat down and nobody knew what to say at first. Then Dinesh's mom pulled out her phone and started showing pictures of Dinesh when he was little. My mom leaned forward to look and I saw tears in her eyes. You looked exactly like that. Exactly. The same smile. Dinesh's mom nodded. When we first saw the DNA results, I thought there was a mistake. But then I found the old clinic paperwork and it all made sense. The two moms started talking about the clinic and the secrecy and the fear of judgment. Dinesh and I sat quietly and let them work through it. By the end of the hour, my parents seemed less defensive, less scared. Dad shook Dinesh's hand before we left and said thank you for meeting us. On Monday, Cassidy found me at my locker before first period. She looked nervous. I wanted to apologize again for how the article affected you. I told her it actually helped. It led to someone from the clinic contacting me with information. It pushed my parents toward honesty. She relaxed a little. If I write any follow-up pieces about donor conception rights, I'll run them by you first. You can choose whether to be involved. That afternoon, I had an appointment with Becca Whitehead to finish my college applications. We sat in her office with all the forms spread out between us. When we got to the race question, she looked at me carefully. What do you want to do with this? I thought about all the boxes. White, Black, Asian, Hispanic, Native American, Pacific Islander. I don't identify with any single category. Can I just check prefer not to say? She nodded. That's a valid choice. Then she helped me brainstorm essay topics. What about writing about navigating uncertainty? About advocating for yourself when you don't have all the answers? I started writing that night, and the essay came together faster than anything I'd written before. It was about learning that some questions don't have simple answers, and that's okay. About how identity is more than checkboxes. About how sometimes the search for answers teaches you more than the answers themselves. When I brought the draft to Becca the next week, she read it twice. This is the most authentic essay I've read all year. It's you. The next day, I found Jeremy in the cafeteria. I need to apologize for putting you in an awkward position with your mom. For dragging you into this whole mess. He shook his head. I understand why you were desperate. I'm glad things are getting better with your parents. You're still the same person you always were. You just know more about where you came from now. It was simple, but it helped. That night, I got a message from Jesse with a list of attorneys who specialize in unsealing donor conception records. You have rights as an adult that you don't have now. Don't give up on getting the full story. I saved the list and started researching what the process might look like after my birthday. 2 days later, Jesse sent me a message through the half-sibling forum with an attachment. The file contained a list of 5 attorneys who specialized in unsealing donor conception records, along with brief notes about their success rates and fee structures. Her message said I should contact them after I turned 18, because I would have rights as an adult that I didn't have now. She added not to give up on getting the full story. I saved the list to a folder on my laptop and spent the evening researching each attorney and reading about the legal process for petitioning courts to unseal sealed records. Most articles said it could take 6 months to a year, and success wasn't guaranteed. But having the information made me feel like I had a plan, instead of just waiting helplessly. The following Tuesday, I joined a video call with the larger half-sibling group using my real name this time, instead of the fake username I'd been hiding behind. About 20 people were on the call from all over the country, and we went around the screen sharing our stories about how we found out and what happened after. Some had known since childhood because their parents told them early. Others found out as adults when they took DNA tests for ancestry or health reasons. Several were still fighting with their parents who refused to acknowledge the truth or blocked them from accessing information. The similarities in our experiences felt both comforting and sad. Toward the end, someone asked if I planned to try contacting the donor when I turned 18. I said I wasn't ready to decide that yet because I was still processing everything and figuring out what I needed. A few people nodded like they understood that hesitation. Thursday afternoon, my parents and I had another session with Niall where we talked about what progress looked like going forward. My parents agreed to stop blocking my access to medical information and to support my relationships with my half-siblings instead of treating them like a threat. They also agreed to give me whatever information they legally could when I turned 18, even though some details would still be sealed by the settlement. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it felt like real progress after months of stonewalling and deflection. Niall said we were learning to communicate honestly, instead of avoiding hard topics, and that was significant growth for our family. Saturday morning, Dad asked if I wanted to go for a run with him, just the two of us. We drove to the trail by the reservoir and started jogging in silence for the first mile. Then he started talking about how scared he and Mom were when they couldn't have kids, and how the clinic made them feel like failures when the treatments kept not working. He said they thought using a donor would solve everything and give them the family they wanted, but they didn't think about what it would mean for me later. He admitted they handled this badly and were so focused on protecting themselves from judgment and harassment that they didn't think about what I needed. I told him I was still angry about the lies and the years of deflection, but I was trying to understand their perspective too. We ran another 2 miles without talking, and it felt like something between us had shifted slightly. The acceptance letter arrived in early December from the in-state university with a decent scholarship and a solid program. I opened it at the kitchen table and just stared at the congratulations paragraph for a minute. It felt like a small victory, even though it didn't solve the bigger questions about my identity or give me the answers I'd been searching for. I was learning that life kept moving forward, even when you didn't have all the answers you wanted, and sometimes you had to make decisions with incomplete information. That afternoon, I called Drew Landry's office and scheduled my own follow-up cardiology appointment for next year, putting it in my phone calendar. Taking charge of my own health monitoring felt like a step toward adulthood and independence. His office sent me the intake paperwork, and I filled it out myself, including the family history section, where I listed the heart conditions reported by my half-siblings in as much detail as I had. I met with Heather one more time the following week to prepare for petitioning to unseal my records after my 18th birthday in March. She spread out forms and explanations across her desk and walked me through the process step by step. She explained it would take months and might not succeed because courts were often reluctant to break sealed settlements, but I had the right to try. She said advocating for myself mattered regardless of the outcome. I left her office with a folder full of forms and instructions and a clearer sense of what the next year might look like. At our next family dinner, I asked my parents direct questions about the clinic and the donor and the settlement instead of dancing around the topic. They gave me direct answers instead of jokes or deflections. They couldn't tell me everything because of the legal agreements, but they told me what they could about the timeline and the process and why they made the choices they made. It was still frustrating to hit walls where information was sealed, but the honesty felt like progress. We were learning to talk about this like it was real instead of pretending it didn't exist or waiting for some magical future date when everything would suddenly be okay. I was filling out my final college application when I got to the demographics section one last time. I looked at the boxes for race and ethnicity and checked prefer not to disclose. I realized I was okay with that choice. I didn't have all the answers about my identity, and I might never have them completely, but I knew who I was as a person. I had a plan for getting more information when I turned 18. I had a community of half-siblings who understood what I was going through. I had parents who were finally being honest with me, even if they couldn't tell me everything. It wasn't the ending I imagined when I first saw those DNA results at Jeremy's house, but it was real, and it was mine. That's where we'll end today's story. Thanks for being here. It really makes a difference knowing these words reach someone. I hope it added a bit of warmth to your day. Subscribe if you'd like to keep sharing stories like this together.